I am Mara Ellison, and I am 38 years old. The morning he said it to me, the day had already settled into my bones before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. It was the kind of morning that arrives quietly but carries weight, the sort that feels predecided, as though events have already agreed among themselves how things will unfold. I remember standing in my driveway with my car door open, keys warm in my palm, the air cool enough to still smell like night. And that was when he leaned against my fence, smiled the way people do when they believe they are being clever, and told me, softly, almost kindly, that I couldn't afford to leave today. Before we continue, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like this reach people who understand patience, boundaries, and quiet strength, and your support helps them travel further than I ever could alone. His words landed without ceremony. No threat. No raised voice. Just an assumption spoken aloud, as if naming something that already belonged to him. And if it had been another day, another hour, or if I had been someone else, I might have laughed. I might have asked what he meant. But I didn't. I stood there with the car idling softly behind me, my bags already settled in the trunk, and let the sentence drift between us without touching anything it was meant to bruise. The neighborhood was suspended in that narrow window between departures and awakenings. Early commuters were gone, late sleepers still pretending. Lawns were darkened by overnight sprinklers, and the street carried the faint scent of cut grass and sun-warmed asphalt. I had chosen that hour deliberately. It was usually mine, a pocket of time that required no explanations, no negotiations. A time when I could leave without anyone tracking the direction of my tires. I had packed the night before with the windows open, the house breathing around me. There was no urgency in it, just repetition. Folding clothes with the calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. Comfortable things. Practical things. Nothing that required a decision I might later regret. The bags were already arranged in the trunk exactly the way I preferred. Heavier ones to the left so they wouldn't shift, lighter ones tucked in close like they trusted me to drive carefully. The car itself was positioned perfectly. All I had to do was reverse and go. Except I couldn't. His truck sat directly behind mine, close enough that I could see the dust pattern on the grill, the shallow scratch along the passenger door I'd watched him pretend not to notice months ago. The tires were turned slightly toward the curb, as if the position were temporary. A pause. Not a choice. But we both knew better. And that knowledge sat between us without needing to be named. His name was Caleb Rourke, and he had been my neighbor on Ashmere Lane for just over 3 years. Long enough for his presence to blend into the background of my days. Long enough that I knew the sound of his garage door, the rhythm of his weekends, the way he stood too close when he talked. His body angled not toward me, but toward whatever space he seemed to be claiming next. In all that time, nothing about him had ever risen to the level of open conflict. And I understood now that it was because conflict requires friction. Caleb never pushed hard. He didn't need to. It started with small things. The kinds of things you tell yourself aren't worth mentioning because mentioning them would feel petty. His car drifting a few inches over the painted line when he parked. His trash bin inching closer to my side of the curb each week until one day I realized I was wheeling it back without remembering when that became my responsibility. His ladder leaning against my fence one afternoon with an apologetic shrug that never quite reached his eyes. Each thing arrived wrapped in easy familiarity, suggesting we were participating in something together rather than him slowly testing how much of my space could be treated as communal. That morning, he was dressed for nowhere in particular. Worn jeans, a faded t-shirt, his coffee cup balanced on the fence rail like it belonged there. When he smiled, it was the same expression he used when he borrowed tools and returned them late. A smile that assumed consent retroactively. "You heading out?" he asked, nodding at the open trunk. The question required no answer. I could hear a lawn mower starting somewhere down the block. The sound drifted closer, then settled into a distant hum that made everything else feel briefly suspended. "Just for a few days," I said. It was true, and truth has a way of smoothing conversations that don't deserve resistance. I adjusted one of the bags in the trunk, even though it didn't need adjusting. The motion gave my hands something to do, while my mind remained still. He took a sip of his coffee and glanced back at his truck, as if noticing its placement for the first time. Then he shrugged. A practice gesture. "I'll move it later," he said. Later was one of his favorite words. It belonged to a future that rarely arrived on time. No rush though, right? That was when he leaned against the fence and delivered his line. "You can't afford to leave today." His voice was casual, almost kind, and for a brief moment, I considered the possibility that he believed he was being helpful. That in his mind, he was offering insight into a world he assumed I navigated with less ease than he did. The thought passed quickly, because what mattered wasn't what he thought he was doing. It was what he assumed he could do without consequence. I looked at him then. Really looked. Not with anger or fear, but with clarity. I noticed how his eyes lingered on my car, as if measuring it against his own. The faint crease between his brows when he calculated something. The comfort with which he occupied my morning, as though it had been set aside for him. And I felt no rush of indignation. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the shape of things as they were. Nothing about the situation required urgency. And that realization settled into my chest with surprising steadiness. "I'll see you later," I said. Politeness is a habit that dies hard. I closed the trunk with a firm, measured push. The latch clicked into place, final in a way the morning was not. He watched me, his smile lingering, waiting for me to say more. To ask him to move. To negotiate. To explain. I didn't. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional. I turned the key in the lock. The car responded with a brief, obedient chirp. Inside, the house was cool and dim. The curtains were drawn back just enough to let in a wash of soft light that traced the outlines of furniture I had chosen carefully over time. Pieces that fit rather than filled. I set my keys on the small table by the door and noticed how calm everything felt. How unchanged. As if the world outside hadn't tried to intrude at all. I moved slowly through the rooms, not because there was anything left to do, but because movement can be grounding. My hand trailed along the back of the couch, the edge of the kitchen counter, the doorframe marked faintly from the day I moved in and misjudged the angle of a box. From the front window, I could see him still by the fence, his truck unmoved, his attention drifting to his phone with the casual confidence of someone who believed the morning would unfold according to his expectations. I wondered how often he mistook restraint for lack of options. The thought didn't trouble me. I checked the stove though I knew it was off, straightened a stack of mail without reading it, adjusted the angle of a chair that had been nudged out of alignment. Small acts that might have looked like hesitation to someone searching for it, but were in truth the final gestures of a routine carried out with care rather than doubt. When I returned to the door, I paused with my hand on the knob, listening to the muted sounds of the street. The mower stopping. A car door closing. A distant laugh. I felt exactly where I was meant to be. I opened the door, stepped outside briefly, then closed it again and locked it behind me. The sound was clean. Decisive. The house seemed to exhale. Not in relief. In recognition. I stood there with my back against the door, listening to the familiar quiet rearrange itself. The hum of the refrigerator. The ticking clock in the hallway. Ordinary sounds that had accompanied far more complicated days without asking questions. I didn't feel trapped. That detail mattered most. I walked back toward the kitchen, my thoughts moving without urgency, lining themselves up in an order shaped over months by decisions made carefully and without witnesses. From the window above the sink, I could still see the edge of his truck catching the light. I observed it without judgment. The morning hadn't veered off course. It had simply revealed itself. I poured another cup of coffee and let the heat seep into my palms. And I thought of how often women are taught to equate calm with surrender, as if silence were evidence of resignation rather than choice. The house held my routines well. I noticed details with precise clarity. The floorboard that creaked only if stepped on at an angle. The line of sunlight tracing the rug. The smell of clean cotton from folded laundry. There was nothing dramatic about the waiting. And that was what made it effective. I sat at the small desk near the window and opened my laptop. The screen lit up to a desktop organized by category rather than urgency. What had been set in motion over the past several months hadn't happened in a moment of resolve, but through ordinary interactions, appointments during lunch breaks, forms completed with care, questions asked at the right time. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just attention. I checked the time. Took a sip of coffee. Thought of the first moment I realized what I wanted from my home wasn't protection, but definition. The clean certainty of knowing where something began and ended. There had been times I considered saying something directly. When the fence line became less of a suggestion and more of an interpretation. When objects appeared and remained as if waiting to be legitimized by my silence. But some conversations are only useful if the other person is prepared to hear the answer. Instead, I listened. And I learned. I closed the laptop without making changes and stood, stretching slowly. Outside, the street was waking fully now. A delivery truck passed. A neighbor walked a dog. His truck remained. I noted it the way one notes the weather. In the bedroom, my phone rested on the dresser. I picked it up. The gesture was unremarkable, and that was the point. The message I typed was brief. A confirmation, not a request. I hesitated only long enough to check for errors. Then I pressed send, and I felt nothing but certainty. Outside, the morning gathered momentum. Somewhere beyond my sight, processes were already moving, systems that didn't require my presence to proceed. I was never going to argue. And now, there was nothing left to do but let the day unfold exactly as planned. The first sound did not arrive as an interruption so much as an adjustment. A low vibration threaded through the morning, subtle at first, altering the texture of the quiet without demanding attention. It felt less like noise and more like pressure, the kind that settles in before a storm breaks. At the time, it registered only as a shift, something moving closer, something heavier than the ordinary rhythms of the street. The living room was still half-lit, curtains drawn just enough to soften the glare of the late morning sun. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, undisturbed. When the vibration deepened, it carried through the floor rather than the air, faint but unmistakable beneath bare feet. There was no instinct to rush to the window. No need to confirm what was already expected. Remaining still felt appropriate, as though movement might interrupt a sequence that had been carefully set in motion. As the sound layered itself into clarity, the hum of idling engines, the hydraulic sigh of machinery settling into place, the sharp punctuation of metal against pavement, the street shifted. Calm gave way to purpose. The scale of the block changed in an instant. Parked cars appeared smaller. Houses more contained. The presence of something larger recalibrated everything around it. From behind the curtain, only a fraction of the scene was visible at first. A large vehicle had turned onto Ashmere Lane, its size commanding attention without theatrics. Another followed, then another, each aligning with practiced precision. Doors opened. Men stepped down wearing clothes marked by use rather than branding. Their movements were efficient, unhurried. No one gestured wildly. No one sought permission. They gathered briefly near the curb, conferring over a clipboard. Heads nodded once. Agreement reached without debate. The choreography was unmistakable, the kind that comes from repetition, from processes refined long before arriving at this particular street. The neighbor emerged from the edge of his driveway, drawn by the noise like anyone else. The casual ease that had marked his morning expression was gone, replaced by curiosity not yet sharpened into concern. His gaze swept the street, taking in the equipment, the men, the sudden arrival of authority without announcement. Then his eyes moved toward the house, pausing at the front windows as though expecting an explanation to appear. None did. A man wearing a reflective vest approached the space between the two properties. Papers were unrolled against the hood of a truck and secured with practiced movements. The pages fluttered briefly before settling. Even from a distance, their shape was recognizable. Formal margins. Stamps catching the light. Documents designed not to persuade, but to record. Small signs appeared next, placed along the edge of the street. Each was pressed firmly into the ground with a motion that suggested permanence rather than request. As they appeared at regular intervals, the block itself transformed. Familiar space reorganized into something structured, resistant to casual interpretation. The machinery remained idle for a moment longer, engines humming softly. The pause felt intentional. Not hesitation, but readiness. No one spoke loudly. No one explained what was about to happen. The absence of conversation carried its own authority. The neighbor stepped closer to the curb, body angled toward the men as though proximity alone might grant access. A hand gestured toward his yard. The motion suggested ownership, familiarity, confidence born of habit rather than verification. Nothing happened. The workers continued their preparations without acknowledging him. The delay unsettled him more than immediate refusal might have. When one of the men finally turned, the exchange was brief. Professional distance maintained. Though the words were inaudible, the effect was visible. Brows drew together. A mouth opened as if to interrupt, then closed again when it became clear interruption would not alter the sequence. The curtain fell back into place. Leaning against the wall, the vibration intensified as the first piece of equipment engaged. The sound deepened, more insistent now, and washed through the house without resistance. There was no flinch. Only awareness. From the kitchen, the noise sounded different, filtered through walls and distance, but still present. It served as a reminder that the house was not isolated from the world beyond it, merely insulated enough to allow perspective. Thoughts turned not toward the neighbor, but toward the process itself. The careful choreography required to bring so many elements into alignment. The unseen labor preceding visible change. The patience embedded in preparation. The first unmistakable sign that work had begun came with a sharp crack. Wood gave way under force applied with intention. The sound paused movement mid-step. A hand rested on the back of a chair. The moment stretched just long enough for recognition to settle, not as destruction, but as correction. The removal of something placed without regard for boundaries. Returning to the window, the scene unfolded with methodical care. Sections of fencing were dismantled piece by piece, each handled as material rather than symbol. Stacked neatly, nothing discarded carelessly. Precision governed every motion. The neighbor stood at a distance now, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the area where his yard met the other. For the first time in years, uncertainty registered clearly on his face. Not panic, not anger, something quieter. A mismatch between assumption and reality. As more of the structure came down, the focus of the work became unmistakable. Targeted, confined. A line cut cleanly through the space he had grown accustomed to treating as his own. This was not general disruption. It was precise correction. Attention shifted again. His eyes followed the workers' movements, the placement of equipment, the invisible boundaries they observed without comment. A man carrying a tablet walked the perimeter, stopping at intervals to take photographs. Another followed with measuring tools, confirming distances established long before this morning. The redundancy signaled thoroughness, not doubt. Urgency entered the neighbor's movements. Gestures sharpened. A finger pointed toward his house, then toward the other, as if insistence alone could redraw the map. The response he received was measured and final, delivered without raised voices, without visible frustration. A hand ran through his hair. A step backward. The shift was unmistakable. This was no longer an inconvenience unfolding before him. This was correction without consent. The machinery continued its work. Noise became a constant presence. Unauthorized structures disappeared piece by piece. The space between properties changed, the line emerging with increasing clarity. Order reasserted itself quietly. No spectacle. No triumph. Stepping away from the window felt natural. Trust in the process made supervision unnecessary. Thoughts drifted to family, to how boundaries had always been framed, not as weapons but as necessities. Invisible lines that allow relationships to function without resentment. When the noise began to taper, the most disruptive work complete, the street had fully awakened. Neighbors gathered at a polite distance. Curiosity contained. Questions forming. Narratives taking shape. There was no urge to shape them. Clarity would arrive on its own. The clock marked the hour. Mid-morning slipping toward noon. Timing honored. Plans unfolding as scheduled. A small smile surfaced, not of victory but recognition. Machinery does not negotiate. It follows instructions. Adheres to measurements. Corrects misalignment. Standing in the quiet of the house, the sound outside settling into a steadier rhythm, understanding sharpened. What had been mistaken for ownership was never the target. What had been treated as entitlement was no longer protected by silence. As the heavier noise gave way to a less violent cadence, the light outside sharpened. Details once blurred by convenience stood exposed. The neighbor crossed from confusion into something more urgent. Certainty fractured under the weight of facts it could not bend. Movement through the house continued unhurried. No role existed outside. No benefit in presenting as intermediary. Passing the hallway mirror, the reflection appeared unchanged. Ordinary, as if nothing of consequence were happening at all. From the back of the house, voices rose and fell in measured tones. The cadence of explanation rather than defense. Someone speaking from a framework that required no improvisation. Gestures outside grew sharper, edged with insistence, betraying an awareness that the situation could not be talked into submission. There is a particular panic that announces itself through repetition. The same claim offered again and again, each variation hoping to produce a different outcome. That stage arrived quietly. A word carried clearly through the space, survey, or something like it. Pages rustled. Fingers traced lines drawn long before either neighbor arrived on this street. Assumptions built on the hope that no one would look too closely began to collapse. Standing near the living room window without approaching it, absence became deliberate. Silence carried weight. Outside, the neighbor's voice rose again, accusation framed as question. Paper rustled. Authority answered without cruelty. Information delivered independent of belief. Machinery repositioned. Work resumed with renewed focus. Confirmation, not hesitation. The decisive exchange had already occurred. Any argument mounted had been answered not with debate, but with documentation. The stillness that followed a statement too definitive to challenge settled over the space. The imagined words were simple, unadorned. Something like, "That was never yours." The neighbor did not explode. He imploded. Gestures shrank. Certainty folded inward. A brief pang of empathy surfaced, not for loss, but for the confrontation with truth delayed too long. No door opened. No explanation offered. Context existed in forms immune to dismissal. Absence ensured outcome. Removal continued. Care bordered on respect, not for what was taken away, but for the order being restored. The boundary emerged clean and unmistakable. Thoughts returned again to the ease with which lines blur when unenforced. Familiarity mistaken for permission. Silence interpreted as approval. Another attempt followed. Softer this time. An appeal rather than a challenge. The reply remained kind, measured, unyielding. A closed system explained plainly. References to filings. Notices issued. Windows closed. Drama absent because discretion no longer existed. Inside, continuity prevailed. Nothing internal disturbed. Revenge, often misunderstood as emotional spectacle, revealed itself as something else entirely. Administrative, procedural, rooted in patience rather than impulse. As final pieces were removed, engines idled once more. Tools were gathered. Lists checked. Nothing left unresolved. The neighbor watched with dawning awareness that the day he attempted to control had instead exposed how little control had ever been present. One final effort to engage met posture of refusal. Final, not dismissive. Ownership settled beyond appeal. What had been claimed through assumption returned to its proper status. Encroachment corrected. Sitting on the couch, the noise faded into background hum. The satisfaction felt had nothing to do with discomfort inflicted elsewhere. Balance restored required no witnesses. When the last official walked the perimeter, making notes, the street settled into a new configuration. Disruption gave way to normalization. The neighbor remained standing amid the altered landscape, certainty replaced by recalibration rather than defeat. Closure arrived quietly, before the day fully unfolded. Truth established in a way immune to narrative. The truck no longer blocked the driveway, moved without ceremony. A concession made not to a person, but to reality. The words spoken that morning echoed differently now. What had been mistaken for limitation revealed itself as restraint. Waiting had never been about inability. It had been about timing. By the time the street found its quieter rhythm, purposeful disruption complete, keys rested again in hand. The moment planned for had arrived without spectacle. Alignment achieved. Leaving had always been part of the sequence. And now nothing stood in the way. The driveway was clear. That detail carried more weight than any argument ever could. It didn't announce itself with drama or triumph. It simply existed, unobstructed, waiting the way it always had when nothing was being tested. Standing there with my keys in my hand, I felt no rush of adrenaline, no urge to savor the moment. Completion rarely feels loud when it has been earned patiently. I stepped outside for the first time since the morning began. The light had shifted, sharpened into something brighter, more revealing. The air no longer held the softness of early hours. It was fully awake now, and so was the street. Neighbors lingered at a distance, pretending to check phones or adjust bags of groceries while quietly absorbing the changes. Curiosity hovered, but no one crossed the invisible line into commentary. The space between the properties looked different. Not larger, exactly, but truer. Clean edges where assumptions had once blurred. The fence stood straight, no longer burdened by attachments that had never belonged. The ground beneath it appeared lighter somehow, as if relieved of weight it had carried without complaint. Caleb stood near what remained of his yard. His posture had changed. No casual lean. No claim of familiarity. When he noticed me, there was a brief delay, as though he needed an extra moment to reconcile my presence with what had already taken place. Our eyes met, and there was no hostility there. Only awareness. The kind that arrives after something fundamental has shifted. Nothing needed to be said. Words would have implied negotiation, and negotiation had never been part of the process. The car door opened. A bag was placed on the passenger seat with emotion practiced and grounding. Settling into the driver's seat felt ordinary, which was exactly right. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and upholstery, familiar in a way that reassured rather than distracted. Mirrors adjusted. Seatbelt clicked. The engine turned over. The sound cut cleanly through the remaining quiet. Decisive without aggression. Backing out of the driveway required no maneuvering this time. No pause. No calculation. Just motion. Pulling onto Ashmere Lane, the street unfolded as expected. Light traffic. Familiar landmarks. The neighborhood receding in the rearview mirror without asking to be remembered. There was no temptation to look back. The days away passed without incident. They were deliberately unremarkable. Mornings began without interruption. Evenings closed without tension. Routine reclaimed its rightful place. At no point did the events of that morning demand replay. The outcome had been clear enough to render rumination unnecessary. Distance clarified what proximity often obscures. Returning weeks later felt different, though nothing had changed. Or rather, because something had. The absence of unauthorized structures made the street appear wider, more open. Parking in the driveway carried no hesitation. Stepping out into the quiet brought no expectation of engagement. The boundary line was exactly where it should be. No new objects tested it. No subtle creep of belongings seeking legitimacy. The fence stood unencumbered, no longer a suggestion but a fact. Walking the length of the yard, satisfaction surfaced, not triumph, but balance restored. Caleb kept his distance. Interactions, when they occurred at all, were brief and courteous. Stripped of the casual familiarity that once blurred the edges of coexistence. No acknowledgement of what had happened. None was needed. Behavior spoke clearly enough. Vehicles parked squarely within allotted space. Belongings confined to their proper side. The absence of that quiet pressure I had managed for years without naming it became unmistakable. The shift was permanent because it altered behavior rather than provoking reaction. Family noticed the difference during visits. Not because an explanation was offered, but because ease has a way of revealing itself. Movement through the space carried less vigilance. Conversation flowed without background calculation. Understanding passed without words. The story, if it ever circulated, did so without spectacle. No neighborhood scandal. No dramatic confrontation. Just a correction. Quiet. Administrative. Effective. That anonymity brought comfort. Resolution does not require witnesses to be valid. Standing in the yard one evening, watching light fade across space that was unequivocally defined, memory returned to that moment by the fence. The smile. The assumption. The casual declaration of limitation spoken as advice. Anger no longer attached itself to the recollection. Only curiosity remained. How often patience is mistaken for incapacity. Silence for surrender. Money had never been the reason compliance appeared so easy. Constraint had never been the cause of restraint. Waiting had been deliberate. A choice informed by timing and process rather than fear. The moment had arrived not because pressure forced it, but because alignment allowed it. The house stood unchanged. The yard held its shape. The boundary remained respected. Locking the door that evening carried familiar reassurance. Sound clean. Decisive. The understanding settled without ceremony. Revenge, when stripped of spectacle, is rarely about humiliation. It is about restoration. Order returned. Space reclaimed. Systems allowed to function without interference. He believed money was the reason I stayed. It wasn't. It was patience. And eventually that ran out. Before you go, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Stories like this are built quietly, and they travel further when shared by people who understand the power of patience, boundaries, and camaraderie.